Hi, my name's Mike Ehrlich here at the New Jersey Institute of Technology, and we're going to talk about Lehman Brothers 1 year later. A year ago, people thought it was a terrible mistake to let Lehman fall. The popular wisdom was that the failure of Lehman Brothers was a mistake made by the Federal Reserve and Treasury officials who were in charge at that time. I would claim that it was not a mistake, that it was the right thing to let Lehman Brothers fail, and in fact, even at the time, I would have argued that it was the right thing to let Lehman Brothers fail. Why is that? Well, first, Lehman Brothers was not the cause of our financial crisis. Lehman Brothers was merely the trigger. If Lehman Brothers had not been allowed to fail, something else would have been the trigger. Might have been something much worse. If Lehman Brothers had been maintained and they had allowed, say, Merrill Lynch, a much larger firm, to fail, that would have been a much larger catastrophe for the economy. In fact, the general rule of thumb is, and we've learned this from the Asian financial crisis as well as from our own S&L crisis in the 80s, generally, quicker remediation is better than slower remediation. The problem can be reduced and kept smaller. Now, remember back a little over a year ago, they had already bailed out Bear Stearns. They'd bailed out Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They'd established this concept of too large to fail. And of course, they described that space as between Bear Stearns and Fannie and Freddie, which now described a very large group of firms that were in the middle, of which certainly Lehman was in that category. This created what's known as a moral hazard. People who were in that space would have felt that, well, it doesn't really matter if I take risks because I know that I'm going to get bailed. If I have a problem, I'm going to get bailed out by the Federal Reserve and Treasury. Unfortunately, that induces people to take too great risks and allows them to manage their portfolio badly. And of course, I think that's what we saw with Lehman Brothers. And in fact, people were so confident that Lehman Brothers wasn't going to fail that people were prepared to lend money to Lehman Brothers right up to the end. The reserve fund broke the buck on their money market fund because they lent so much money to Lehman Brothers. And when Lehman Brothers failed, that debt was worth less than 100 cents on the dollar. And they assumed that, like Bear Stearns and Fannie and Freddie, that they were in fact going to get bailed out. That assumption had to get changed. It had to get changed at one point or another. Again, I would argue better sooner than later. The last thing I would point out is that with Lehman Brothers' failure, right, the mindset was changed. People understood they had to reduce their risk. Now, we've observed since the Lehman Brothers failure, people have, in fact, reduced their leverage, reduced their risk, and reduced their profile, which is pretty much what the economy had to do one way or another. Lehman was the trigger. A year later, we know it.